In those days, nobody had 200 horsepower motors, but Curtis had one. And this boat went like a rocket ship. And I can't even tell you how fast this boat was. I was actually with him once when the police boat came to pull us over, and he decided to outrun it. And the police sent a helicopter to intercept us. That's a whole different sermon that I'll have to say for a different day.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
Well, my message today is entitled Crash Test Dummies. And you all know what a crash test dummy is. It's one of those lifelike dummies that they put in cars and drive into walls, right? And you know why the crash test dummy doesn't slow down or stop before it hits the wall? Because it's a dummy. That's why. And you know, in a way, it's a little bit of a metaphor for us. And I know that every one of you at some point in your life has been a crash test dummy. Probably somewhere more tilting towards your youth. How many of you lived so recklessly as a young person, you're surprised you survived till now? How many of you? Look at all those hands. And at some point, you were that crash test dummy, and it's a miracle that you're here today. And I'm going to tell at least one autobiographical crash test dummy story, because those are the ones you seem to really enjoy. So I'm about 20 years old. Me and my buddies are down at the lake, and we're water skiing, and Marty's got his boat out, and we're skiing behind his boat. And one of my friends wipes out, big spectacular wipe out behind the boat, and he gets into the boat. We're heading back to the dock, and we're zipping along at about 40 miles an hour. And we get into this conversation about what would be more painful, falling water skiing or falling out of a moving boat. And we couldn't agree on that, so I just stepped on that gunnel and leaped out of the boat while it was going, never said anything, didn't think about what I was doing. I just launched out of the boat. Turns out it does hurt. And so I got into the boat, and I said, that actually kind of hurts. And the guy said, well, I know, but actually water skiing, you'd be going faster than that because you might be cutting across the wake. So really, if you're going to test it, we probably need to go faster. And so Lauren, he wants to test it, and he tells Marty to drive the boat faster. Instead of going 40 miles, go 45 miles an hour. Now, here's the thing you need to understand about young men. The more young men that you gather together in a combined space, the lower the collective intelligence is. It just drops precipitously. It's been tested scientifically by myself and my friends. So I know this is true. So Marty speeds the boat up. He's going 45 miles an hour, and Lauren jumps out. And he comes out, and of course, he's pretending it didn't hurt, right? Yeah, that didn't hurt. That didn't hurt. And so I said, well, how fast will the boat go? Marty says, it's a pretty fast boat. It'll do 50 miles an hour. I said, book it. And so he hits it. And I leap out of the boat at 50 miles an hour, and I'm not ashamed to tell you, it really hurt. But I wasn't going to tell anybody it really hurt, because that's not how this game works. And so I got out of the boat, and I said, that barely even hurt. And I got out, and then so Lauren says, what we really need is a faster boat. And of course, we had Curtis with us, and Curtis had a faster boat. My friend Curtis had this boat here. It was a 19-foot J-craft with a 200 Black Max on it. That boat weighed like 600 pounds. And the speedometer only went to 60, and the boat just kept on going. So who knows how fast that boat went. In those days, nobody had 200 horsepower motors, but Curtis had one. And this boat went like a rocket ship. And I can't even tell you how fast this boat was. I was actually with him once when the police boat came to pull us over, and he decided to outrun it. And the police sent a helicopter to intercept us. That's a whole different sermon that I'll have to say for a different day. But in this particular day, we said we need a faster boat, and so Curtis went and got his boat. We all got in that boat. He was going probably somewhere in the 60-mile-an-hour range, and Lauren jumped out. And when he hit that, he might as well have jumped out of a moving car onto pavement, and it's etched in my mind, the picture. I can still see it to this day. And it was head, feet, head, feet, head, feet, head, feet. I thought he was never going to stop flipping. And I know he was in a lot of pain because we had to haul him into the boat. To which he said, Mark, it's your turn. To which I said, no, you win. And there's something about youth, and there's something about how we live in life, and we don't want to be too judgmental because we're all crash test dummies in one level or another. We've all done stupid things. I'm not going to ask you to put up your hand, but you've all done something stupid, and after you've done it, you've thought to yourself, what was I thinking? And the answer is nothing. You weren't thinking anything. You just did it. I mean, I look into Scripture, and I see these people that should know better. I see people like Samson, who was the judge of Israel. And he was consorting with prostitutes and hanging out with one named Delilah who was trying to get him and betray him. And he knew darn well, what was he thinking? Well, we know he wasn't thinking with his brain, right? We know that story. Then we have David. He's the king of Israel. And I mean, he's the man after God's own heart. And he's done all these great, wonderful things. And yet, he sees a woman across the street, and he commits adultery with her, and he conspires to cover it up, and then he murders her husband. David, what were you thinking? And then we have a Jonah. Jonah is told to go and tell the people of Nineveh to repent, and he gets on a boat to run away from God. Like, that'll work. What was he thinking? And every one of these stories, and I could give you a dozen more, they actually were people that hit the wall, weren't they? They were crash test dummies. They did something stupid, and there was consequences. I mean, Samson lost his eyes, lost his strength, and eventually lost his life. David lost that child from that relationship that was born into the world. And, of course, Jonah, he ended up in the belly of the great fish. But you know what? A lot of times God has a way of turning these things around for good. I mean, think of Jonah. He was down in the mouth, but he came out okay in the end. Yeah, that was pretty cheesy. I get it. But here's what I want to talk about today, is that it's an interesting thing that when we hit the wall, and eventually everybody does at least one or several stupid things in life, and you hit the wall, and it's fascinating to me how often God is there to meet you, and it's those moments of your stupidity that God uses the most in your life. And the scripture says this, where sin abounds, grace abounds the more. And so rather than getting distressed about the friends and relatives and people you know and the things going on in our world and the crash test dummies that are all around you, rather than getting distressed about that, understand that it is those times when they hit the wall that they will come face to face with the grace of God. You see, not everybody hits bottom. We always say, well, you know, someday they'll hit bottom. Actually, that's not true. Not everybody hits bottom, but eventually everybody hits the wall. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I want to tell you a story about the conversion. It's a story you know, the conversion of Saul of Tarsus. Now, Saul of Tarsus, he was a piece of work, wasn't he? I mean, this guy was persecuting the church. He was railing against the church. He was, he was the one who consented to the death of Stephen. He was actually executing Christians. And of course, you remember the story of Stephen. He was the one who was stoned while he was preaching, which meant something totally different back then than it does today, right? And here we have him. We see him in Acts chapter 9, and it says he was breathing threats against the church, and he was on his way to Damascus to see if he could round up some Christians to arrest them and to execute them. And that's where we're going to pick this story up. It's Acts chapter 9, and we're going to look at verse 3. It says, and as he journeyed, he came near Damascus, and suddenly a light shone around him from heaven. And then he fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you, Lord? And the Lord said, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. It is hard for you to kick against the goads. So he trembled and astonished said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And the Lord said to him, arise and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. So here is the moment, and I want you to think about it because he is on his way to do something stupid in our estimation, and that's persecute and kill Christians. And he's on his way to do this, and he hits the wall. This crash test dummy had an encounter where he comes up against Jesus himself. And I don't know if you've ever been to Damascus. I've never been there, and probably with what's going on in Syria, I won't be going anytime soon. But they have a statue of this that I think is quite beautiful. And this is a picture of the statue that they have in the city of Damascus. And that's Paul. And I've never imagined him falling off a horse. I never thought of that, but it probably makes sense. He could very well have been on a horse on his road to Damascus. And it says he fell to the ground, could have fallen off his horse. And he got interrupted, and the voice from heaven comes and says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Paul says, who are you? And he says, I am Jesus, whom you are persecuting. And then he uses this expression. He says, it's hard for you to kick against the goads. And we don't really understand that expression because we don't use the expression goads. But I have a more common word, a vernacular word that you do understand that means the same thing, and it's cattle prod. If you have a really stubborn beast and you poke it with the goad, it might kick at that prod. And when it kicks at that prod, guess what? That only makes it worse, doesn't it? Because it has the potential of going in even more strongly into the hide. And so he brings this up and he says, why are you resisting the prodding? Why are you resisting the poking? And I don't want you to miss this. You know what this means? This means that God had been trying to get Paul's attention or Saul's attention for a very long time. Would you agree to that? And finally, he's got him. Finally, he's arrested him. Now, here's what I find a bit amazing about this story. I don't know if you've thought about it in these terms. If you take a guy like Saul of Tarsus, a very bad dude, persecuting the church, killing Christians, and who knows what else he was doing, and you would think that if he came face to face with God, he would face his judgment. But that's not what happens. He comes face to face with God's grace. And this message today is all about grace, and it's all about how when we're the crash test dummy and when we hit the wall, or people you know hit the wall, they will often be met with the grace of God. And I like to spell grace this way, G-R-A-C-E, God's riches at Christ's expense. And everything he does in your life, he does it by the grace of God. Grace is this incredibly powerful force that works in our life, and that's the best news to think that when we hit the wall, that he'll be there. Because when sin abounds, grace abounds the more. So I'm going to give you 3 things about grace today. And the first one is this, that grace chases. The second one, grace embraces. And the third one, grace erases. Do you notice how they all rhyme? That's a miracle. It's fantastic. And, sermons need to rhyme or at least have alliteration. But anyway, so we're going to start with this, that grace, first of all, chases. Grace chases. And so I want to show you a little verse here that Paul talks about later, because when this is all happening, Saul doesn't really understand what was going on in his life. But in retrospect, he looks back and he's figured a lot of it out. And so here's the passage I want to share with you. It's Galatians chapter 1, verse 15 and 16. Listen carefully. It says, when it pleased God, who separated me from my mother's womb and called me through his grace to reveal his Son to me. So he says that the Son, Jesus, was revealed to me through his grace. Did you catch that part? It was through his grace. But here's the bigger question. When did he do that? Or from when? From his mother's womb. See, a lot of times we look at this and we think, Paul encountered grace on the road to Damascus. Well, that was true, but that's not where it started. In retrospect, he looks back at it and realizes that God's grace had been working in him from his mother's womb, and more accurately, from the foundation of the earth. And I'll tell you something, you don't realize that until you're at this point in life and you begin to look back retrospectively on your life, and you see all of those points along the way where God was gracious and where God was prodding you and poking you with the goads, and all those times that God was trying to get a hold of you, but you were too stubborn and you wouldn't listen. And then you look back and you realize this whole journey and everything happened, and even the mistakes in your life, God is somehow using them to bring you to this place. And Paul says, his grace was working in me from my mother's womb. And I know in this room there are people, and you can look back at your life when you weren't serving God, and you can see the hand of God working. The Reformers called that prevenient grace. And that meant grace that goes beforehand, and how grace precedes you and gets ready to bring you to that place where you are today. And if you look back at your life, many of you could probably identify those moments. Now, I'm going to tell you yet another crash test dummy story of my own that this illustrates this point 100% that I'm talking about today. So again, I'm probably in my early 20s or something like that, and one evening, my friend Dave comes by and he's bought a new car. Well, not new to him. And he's bought an Mgb Convertible. How many of you remember this car, the Mgb Convertible? Here's a picture of it. It was this very color. It was kind of beat up like that one. It was this very color, called it British Racing Green. And there was a lot of them that color. Those of you that were of my era, you know that. So he comes by with this car. Check that car out. It's a convertible. It's got no roof. It's got no roll bar. It had no seat belts. So he comes over. He says, look at the car. I paid about $4,500 for it. And Dave says, look at my car. I just got it today. Come on, hop in. We'll take you for a ride. He says, where do you want to go? I said, let's go to the racetrack. Now, when I said the racetrack, just so you know, I don't mean like a racetrack. I mean South Drive. South Drive is just over here, just a few blocks from here. How many of you know what South Drive is? It's a few blocks over from here. And when I was growing up, there was no stop signs on South Drive. And we used to race around it. And it curves along the river like this. And you can have a lot of fun on that street because you don't have to stop at any stop signs. And so we would go out and we would actually go around South Drive. And then you come around on North Drive. And we would time each other. This is how stupid we were. Did I mention I was stupid when I was young? Well, I was stupid. Anyway, so I said, let's go to the racetrack. So we go down to the South Drive, and he starts, and we're going, and that car was handling like it was on rails, going through around all those curves down South Drive. And, you know, in those days, you could drive as fast as you wanted, apparently. So we're driving down there, and then what happens at the end of South Drive, it makes a 90-degree left turn right at St. John's Ravenscourt. And then there's the straightaway, which is about a quarter-mile long, and then it makes another 90-degree turn going the other way. So he got to the first 90-degree, made the 90-degree turn. We were doing a pretty good clip, and he puts it to the pin. And he's going full out along there, and he's going faster and faster and faster, and he's coming up to the second 90-degree turn, right? And as he's coming up to me, I realize he's not slowing down, and he's not stopping because he is a crash test dummy, right? And I realize we're in trouble, and so finally I yell at him. I yell at him too late. I said, there's a turn! And so what he does, instead of hitting the brakes, which would have probably been the right thing to do, instead of hitting the brakes, he cranked it hard over to the left. And the car turned sideways like this and kept going that direction. And so he cranks it hard over. We're now turned sideways and we're heading this way. Now, if you know this corner that I'm talking about, here's the problem. That corner is also the dike for the Red River. And we went across the shoulder sideways, down the dike, into the ditch, through the ditch, up on the other side, and we slid 100 yards into the soccer field before we came to a stop. This whole time, I knew it was going to happen because I watch a lot of TV. And I know what happens on TV is that the car begins to roll and roll and roll, and on the last roll, it bursts into flames and consumes its inhabitants. And so anyway, I knew, honest, I'm not joking about this, I didn't think it was going to burst into flames, but I thought we were going to roll any moment. And had it rolled, and I was expecting at any moment for it to roll, and I was expecting for me to die, and if that had happened, this would be the end of the sermon. Oh, wait a minute, maybe there wouldn't be a sermon. But you get my point. And when we got into that field sitting there and realized that somehow this car had gone down the embankment through the ditch and up on the other side and had not rolled, we were both sitting there shaking like Paul was when he fell off the horse in Acts chapter 9. Let me ask you a question. How many of you have been in a car accident where you thought it was certain death and somehow nothing happened? How many of you have been in that car accident? How many of you were shaking? Were you shaking? You were just shaking. We just sat there and we shook. And we shook, and we shook. We didn't even look at each other. We didn't say a word. We didn't drive away. We just sat there shaking in terror. Let me tell you something. Without knowing who God was, in that moment, I knew I had had a divine encounter. I knew that God, in that moment, we both did. We both knew that by what I know as the grace of God, we knew in that moment that the grace of God had spared our lives. And for whatever reason, God said, your time is not yet. Let me tell you the end of the story. Within 6 months, both Dave and I came to Christ, and within 6 years, both of us were pastors. See, that's the prevenient grace. That's the grace of God that chases us. That's the grace of God that is after us. And he is oftentimes working in people's lives, actually sometimes several times, where they have this opportunity, but we kick against the goads, and we kick against the goads, and we resist. And there comes that point where we need to accept it and receive it. And for me, that was my moment. For Paul, this was his moment. And you have to, Paul said, Lord, what do you want me to do? Did you notice this, that he knew who Jesus was? How did he know who Jesus was? He called him Lord. He said, Lord. He knew in that moment. He probably didn't know how he knew, but he knew. See, when you encounter Jesus, you know who he is. There's no mistaking. And that's what happened to me that day. And every one of us has to have that moment where we say yes to God's grace. Grace chases. The second thing is grace embraces. So Paul falls down. He gets blinded by the light. He says, what do you want me to do? And he says, go to the city and I'll tell you what to do. And so he's blind. And so whoever was with him guided him by the hand and took him into the city of Damascus. And then he encounters a man there by the name of Ananias. And don't miss what happened. And Ananias reached out and laid hands on him and prayed for him. And then this is what it says. And it says it was as if scales fell from his eyes and he could see. And I don't want you to miss that it was only after he was prayed for that what seemed like scales fell from his eyes. And there is a reason why people in this world do not know who Jesus is. And that is because the scripture says the God of this world has blinded their eyes from the hope and the truth of the gospel. And you know, to me it's bizarre that there would be anybody that wouldn't believe in God. I mean, when we look at the world, when we look at creation, we look at the universe, and we look at everything that God has made, creation screams out the existence of God. You couldn't talk me out of the belief in God. Probably you're the same way. And we look at these people and say, why don't they believe? I'll tell you why they don't believe. Because the God of this world has blinded their eyes. And what has to happen by the grace of God is these scales need to fall off their eyes. And as soon as those scales fall off their eyes, then it all comes clear. How many of you know what I'm talking about? You've experienced that in your own life. The scales fell off. And I want you to go with me. Well, I'll throw it on the screen. This is in Romans chapter 16. Paul actually explains, if you read between the lines, what happened. It's remarkable. Romans 16, verse 7 says, greet Andronicus and Junius, my relatives. King James says kinsmen, people he was related to. Let's go with brother-in-law. He says, meet my brother-in-law who has been in prison with me. They are outstanding among the apostles. Here it is. And they were in Christ before I was. Here's my question for you. If you had a brother-in-law like Saul of Tarsus who was persecuting the church and killing Christians, would you be praying for him? You're darn right you'd be praying for him. That's what you'd be doing. You'd be praying for him. And I think that's exactly what has happened here. There were people praying for him, and because people were praying for him, the scales fell from his eyes. And whoever you have in your life, the crash test dummies in your life, you need to be praying for these people, and God, by his grace, will embrace them and change their life. That's how it works. And you might think that maybe the church isn't growing, but I'll tell you, in North America, but I'll tell you around the world, there are people coming to Christ in every single nation, all over the world. There are certain continents where people are coming to Christ. In Asia and Africa and South America, people are coming to Christ like you've never seen before. In fact, let me let you know a little statistic. There are more Christians in the world today that speak Swahili or Spanish than French and English combined. You might be surprised who you're going to meet when you get to heaven. Because sometimes people think that Christianity is the white man's religion. You know that thing? It's like this story of Hank and Charles, best friends, love each other. Hank's white, Charles is black, and the big argument, big discussion they always have is God white or is he black? And they were arguing about it one day while they were driving along, a couple of crash test dummies, I guess, and Hank got so animated about it, he wasn't watching where he'd go, drove right into a pole, killed them both. And the next moment, they're standing before the gates of heaven. Charles is mad. He says, nice going, Hank. Now we're dead. Hank says, well, think of the bright side. Now we get to find out, is Jesus white or black? Just then, the gates of heaven open, and Jesus is standing there and greets them by saying, buenos dias, mi amigos en Cristo. God's grace chases. God's grace embraces. God's grace erases. I want you to think about who Saul of Tarsus was. He was the greatest persecutor of the church in his day. He, by his own admission, refers to himself as the chief of sinners, and yet he becomes the chief of the apostles. His entire past got erased by the grace of God. I want to close with one final story here today. Several years ago, I was invited to a prayer breakfast, and it was a big prayer breakfast with some 500 people there, and apparently they thought I was important because they put me at the head table with the guest speaker. And the guest speaker's name was Sasha Leclair. And here's a picture of Serge. And we sat there, and I got to know this man, and he told me his remarkable story. And he was born in an abandoned warehouse in Montreal to a 13-year-old Cree girl, a product of rape. And he got born in this warehouse. He ended up in foster care and eventually ended up in residential school. And in this residential school, he was sexually abused. And he took a knife and he stabbed his abuser and got branded a crazy man or brain damage. And he wore that brain damage with a badge of honor. Eventually, he got kicked out of the school. He ended up on the streets of Montreal by 15 years old, carrying a gun, doing crimes, running drugs, and got involved with Canada's biggest organized drug crime ring at that time. He starts to move his way up the ranks. There's a big bust in 1984, a $40 million drug bust, and he goes down, gets sentenced to 9 years. He's considered a dangerous offender because he is a dangerous offender. I mean, he was violent. There's a whole bunch of things in his life that I don't have time to tell you about. But he's got all these things in his life. So he goes to prison. Not only does he go to prison, he puts him in the SHU, the special handling unit. We would call that solitary confinement. And there he languished away in this place. He had nobody visiting him because he had no family, remember? He had no friends because your criminal buddies are not your friends. He had nobody visiting him. And he just sat within the four walls of this little cell day after day after day, figuring his life was over. And then one day, a Christian prison worker shows up and wants to visit with him and sits down with him, gives him a Gideon New Testament Bible. And after they've talked for a while, and he realizes the bitter and the angerness and the hatred in this young man, he says to him, Serge, you have to ask yourself a question. Do you want to live like an animal for the rest of your life? Or are you going to see yourself the way God sees you, as a child of God? And by the grace of God, he can change your life. And the worker left, but he left him that Bible. So he starts reading the New Testament. And he was reading the story of Jesus and his disciples a little bit different than you and I would. This is what he told me. He said, I read this book, and as far as I could tell, this Jesus guy was a gang leader. And he had put this gang together of these 12 guys, and they were going out wreaking havoc all over the place and raging against the man. And this is how he's reading the Bible. Right? And he says, I wanted to know what made these guys tick and why they were willing to lay down their life for this cause. And during that process, that threat process, remember that's the world he's coming from, right? He ends up getting saved in 1985 in the penitentiary. And all of a sudden, like that, by the grace of God, he becomes a model prisoner. And he goes on to become the first prisoner in Canadian history to earn a sociology degree while in prison. And then in 1988, he not only got released from prison, catch this, people, don't miss this, he got a full parliamentary pardon of his crimes. His record, his criminal record, was erased. It was erased. And then he went, it's so cool. And then he went on to become the director of Teen Challenge in Saskatoon. And in 2007, he ran for the provincial legislature and became the member of Legislative Assembly in Saskatchewan for his district. And this is what he said. He said, this is the first time in North American history that the lawbreaker has become the lawmaker. And I just want to tell you that story so you'd understand that it doesn't matter who you have in your life. It doesn't matter what they've done. It doesn't matter what you've done. The grace of God is always sufficient. His arm is never too short. Because grace chases, grace embraces, and grace erases and makes us new people. Because that's what grace is. God's riches at Christ's expense. Let's stand together, shall we?
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca. Thank you for watching, and God bless you.